Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on transforming philanthropy, organised by Alliance Magazine and sponsored by Mercer. My name's Andrew Milner. I'm a freelance writer and researcher, and I'm also the features editor of Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. The conversation we're going to have today also heralds Alliance's forthcoming March issue on the same topic, and we're fortunate to have contributors to the issue among our panelists today. In fact, all three of them contributed to the issue. We've got Erin Ganju and Michael Seberich, who were guest editors. We've got Renée Horster, who wrote a good article for the piece. So before I introduce them, just let me say a brief word about the format for this event. We're going to run for an hour. Each of the panelists will make a short presentation, and then we're going to open it up for a question and answer session, which we invite all of you to take part in. You can ask a question anytime using the chat function, which is on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You probably know this works already, but you can see a kind of bubble down there. If you click on that and just type in your question there. We'll be keeping an eye on this during the webinar and selecting questions to put to the panelists in the Q&A. If and when you ask a question, please do tell us who you are and where you're from. Time's obviously limited, but we'll do our best to put as many as we can to a panel. And you can also, as you can see on the bottom of the screen, you can also join the conversation on Twitter using the handle @AllianceMag and the hashtag Transforming Philanthropy. Also, in advance of our March issue, which comes out on the 6th of March, if you want to learn more about this topic, you can subscribe today to Alliance at a 50% discount, which we're offering to all attendees today. If you want to do that, just use the code TRANSFORM, it's uppercase TRANSFORM50 at the checkout to subscribe to the link using the link in the chat. That gives you not only the March issue, but 12 months of issues plus access to the online content, which is news, etc., and also the webinars. Alternatively, if you just want to purchase the issue on transforming philanthropy, it's a single issue. There are also links in the chat for both the print and digital options for you to do that. Okay, so let's get to the meat of the discussion. Transforming philanthropy, how and who? Demands to transform philanthropy becoming increasingly vocal and widespread. These proceed both from the urgency of the problems confronting us and from the growing sense that institutional philanthropy, at least, derives its wealth and its status from a set of arrangements in which injustice is enshrined. Driven by this and under the immediate stimulus of the pandemic, changes have been taking place. So-called trust-based giving has made headway, with grantmakers removing restrictions on funding, relaxing reporting requirements, and getting money more quickly to grantees. But how far have these changes gone? And now that the immediate crisis of the pandemic is past, will they continue in force, or will grantmakers revert to more cautious practices? In addition, transforming philanthropy means a bit more than doing things differently. It also means thinking differently. So how do donors need to change their attitudes as well as their practices? What implications will a thoroughgoing change have for their own organizational structures and culture? What steps internally at foundations should be taking if they are to be seen as part of the solution rather than part of the problem? These are some of the questions we'd like to explore in this webinar. I want to move straight on and bring in our first panelist, Erin Ganju, who unfortunately can't be with us the whole time and has to dash off, so I'm going to bring her straight in. Erin is the Managing Director at Echidna Giving and a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow of the Bosch Academy. Echidna Giving is a private funder focused on the best ways to support quality gender-responsive education in lower-income countries. Erin is also co-founder and former CEO of Room to Read, a global education non-profit. And she's drawn her insights of growing Room to Read as co-author of Scaling Global Change, Social Entrepreneur's Guide to Surviving the Startup Phase and Driving Impact. Welcome to you, Erin. Do come in and tell us all about your experience with Echidna Giving and what transformation looks like for you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for everyone joining today. It's always wonderful to be in community together talking about something that I'm deeply passionate in terms of transforming philanthropy, and particularly today digging into holding ourselves accountable for how we do that, because I think it's, the purpose of the upcoming Alliance special edition is really to focus on how do we do this from within, and I think that's an important aspect of this. As you say, I have an interesting background both from having been a co-founder of Room to Read and really scaled an organization for 20 years, meaning that I spent a lot of time fundraising, obviously, and really understood it from that perspective, and then was able to cross over the aisle when I stepped down to work with a family fund, Echidna Giving, which was a really big decision and not one that I took lightly in terms of moving into the philanthropy, because it wasn't something I necessarily planned to do, but I also knew it was an opportunity to really work with a fund that I did deeply respect their approach to philanthropy and be able to understand how to really scale their giving in an area of education that I really cared about around gender equality. But it's been a challenge in many ways, also with my own roots in the nonprofit world, sort of working in philanthropy now. And so I think it's given me a lot of food for thought over the last several years as I've worked in this philanthropic sector of how important it is to really hold ourselves accountable for how we do our work and how we show up. And I think that's what has been exciting about this opportunity to kind of guest edit with Michael, this new edition, is really inviting a lot of our colleagues to talk about initiatives that they've been engaged in on how we're all working to transform philanthropy. And I would say, one key part, as you mentioned, Andrew, is, where did the money come from and how are we, accountable to putting it to work? I'll probably touch not so much on that. I know Renee, hopefully another speaker, is going to address that more directly. But I'll talk a little bit more about, in terms of institutional philanthropy now, the ways that we really think about showing up in this space. And I think, we're part of a movement that's the trust-based philanthropy movement, which has really been helpful to us in anchoring how we approach our work. Because I think, at the end of the day, one of the things that sort of I find a little bit amusing is how much we kind of pretend that philanthropy isn't highly political. We try to think of it in this very sort of, pristine world, that we're just doing this, good work of giving away money. And really, at the end of the day, everything we are doing in one form or another is really political. And it is, we have a vision of the world. You can agree with it or not agree with it, depending on the institution, but we are, every decision we are making is having an impact on the ecosystem around us. And I think we need to own the fact that, and really acknowledge the fact that, that it is highly political. We at Echidna Giving, one of the things we talk a lot about is how we're standing in solidarity with our grantees. It's not fair to ask them to take on some, really important work, whether they're, working on social justice or different issues around changing gender norms, beliefs, and attitudes. These are, deeply rooted things that can have a lot of backlash, can, have a lot of challenging aspects to the work. And I think we need to own that, we're not one step removed from that. We need to be in the trenches, so to speak, and in this fight with our grantees. And I don't think enough, personally, enough institutional philanthropy sees themselves in that role. And I think that's where we try to have this sort of hands-off approach and, very technical approach to giving that is not really, in my opinion, honors the hard work that, that needs to be done and is being done. So for that, when we look at the trust-based philanthropy movement, it's, there are really some core beliefs in how you show up. I mean, just first, really understanding the sector that you're supporting and building really deep long-term relationships with grantees is important. We really do focus on also the aspects of how we do our grant making, giving multi-year flexible funding, being in the long run with grantees. We have many in our portfolio we've been giving to for 10, 15 years. Echidna Giving is only about 18 years old. So a lot of, grantees are really doing the core work where we stick with them, really being transparent and being able to figure out how to streamline our work. I mean, there's a lot of complexity that can be created. And I think, being as clear and concise and as upfront about, how we can try to break down a lot of that bureaucracy is something we work very hard on. Having one report a year, doing most of our check-ins, really where we show up with, where your work is and just, work alongside you and understand what you're doing a couple times a year is much more interesting and educational than a lot of written reports and indicators and metrics that may or may not tell you what's really happening. And so I think there's, aspects to the movement around trust-based philanthropy that's been really important. And also, I think one of the most important things is genuinely asking for feedback and listening. Again, something that's not, done enough in our sector, and understanding that, lived experience is as important as some of the expertise that we all like to focus on in this sector. And being able to really support beyond just the financial contribution, but what is it that we can do to help be a part of the movement, help, do a lot of connecting and bringing in additional resources than ourselves, by being advocates for the work that we're supporting. So there's a lot of ways that we have had to challenge ourselves to really be, again, standing in solidarity with our grantees. And I think one of the just last points I'll make is that it was a wonderful opportunity to be at the Bosch Academy and to be engaged last year as an American living in Berlin with the German philanthropic sector, and kind of had a unique opportunity to interview about 45 stakeholders in different aspects of philanthropy in Germany, from nonprofits to staff in foundations to academia and the broader infrastructure and ecosystem around philanthropy. And just heard a lot of really rich conversations about what transforming philanthropy looks like in Germany as well, and contribute from the perspective of someone working in a U.S. foundation. And I found that, really enriching to have those conversations. And a lot of very similar themes came up around, experimenting with evolving grant-making practices, and how COVID has, I think we've started on that road. I don't think we've gone far enough, but it was at least a lot more conversations happening, maybe not turning into long-term change in practices, but I think there's an opportunity and a window to continue to really focus on shifting mindsets and engaging more with nonprofits and understanding what really works for them. And I think the other thing that came up a lot is this idea of embracing diversity. And understanding that this should, not just be an external pressure we think we need to do, but it's actually something that really helps us make better decisions. That working, alongside some of our grantees that have more lived proximate experience is critical, but also looking at ourselves in terms of our own organizations, our boards, our leadership, our staff. How do we take a very wide view of diversity from, age, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, immigration experience, career pathways, everything that we can do to think about bringing a more diverse group together, I think will help us make better decisions in our own institutions. So with that, I will hand it back to you as just some opening remarks, Andrew.
Great, thank you very much, Erin. Interesting you mentioned politics. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that later on. Also, the listening thing, I think Michael may have something to say about that when he comes in as well. I just wanted to follow up and ask you, you had this dual sort of position, as it were, having worked as CEO for Room to Read and also now being on the sort of grant making side. How much has that sort of helped inform your choices, as it were? Make you sort of more proximate, if you, whatever the word is, with your grantees?
I think and I've heard from our grantees, it's helped a lot, because we've done a lot of things now at Echidna Giving in order to reduce some of the barriers just of being able to in many ways what people call kind of accessing philanthropy, making it easier to show up and have conversations, understanding being very upfront about what our process is for being able to have a process in terms of applying for Echidna Giving, of what that looks like in terms of how we have a whole orientation once you're part of a portfolio, to talk about how can we work well together, how do we start out our partnership, really listening to each other, just bringing down those barriers where it makes it feel like we're sort of in our own ivory tower, and how can we lower those to really be on the same playing field. We only can succeed together, and I don't think we think enough about our practices in philanthropy to really be approachable and accessible to our grantees, and to do that is one thing that we've really focused on. I think I knew that from being on the outside trying to raise funds. You see all those barriers, which you sometimes don't see within foundations, and I think that's helped us a lot to be much more approachable and accessible.
Great. Thanks, Erin. I guess we better let you go now, because I think I know you've got to dash off. But
I'm so sorry to leave. Yes, Michael and Renee. I wish I could be more longer, but to answer all the questions. But I know that I'll leave it in the hands of colleagues, and really excited about the upcoming edition. So thank you. You
get just to flee. Well, thanks for joining us anyway, and we'll speak again, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to Erin for that. As I say, she's got to dash off now. I'd like to now bring in Renée Horster. Renée is one of the founding members of Resource Transformation, Rückverteilen bewegt, or RTRB for short. Following the example of resource generation in the US, RTRB is a membership organization in German-speaking Europe, which organizes young people with access to wealth to redistribute that wealth to grassroots movements, as well as offering political education on topics such as class privilege, wealth inequality, and social justice. As a person herself with class privilege and access to wealth, She's continuously inspired by grassroots leadership and grateful to have found a community with whom to engage in learning, healing and redistribution. At RTRB, Renée is currently focused on political education, community organising, communications and building partnerships with social movements. Since early 2023, she's also been active as a project coordinator at Institut Solidarische Moderne, progressive think tank in Berlin working towards a just transition. Previously, Renée was project manager at Ashoka and studied sociology, psychology and management at St Andrews in Amsterdam. She's excited about speculative fiction, listening to live music and perfecting her sourdough baking skills. Renée, tempting as it is to exchange notes about sourdough baking, I guess we'd better stick to the topic. Just tell us about your work with RTRB and what it's doing, what happens with it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really good to be plugged in here. We're not a funder, we're not a foundation. We're a political education community organizing organization, basically. We kind of work at the intersection of social justice and philanthropy because we organize people with access to wealth, especially young people with access to wealth. And we have built this community to support people with access to wealth to give away their wealth. So while this is a slightly different group that we're working with, not funders in the institutional sense, I do think there are some similarities in the kind of problems we are facing when giving away wealth and the problems surrounding power imbalances and foundations. So yeah, I hope we can learn from each other's work here. And I, again, not as a person that works in a foundation myself, but I just wanted to share two things that I've observed from being in philanthropic spaces where I felt like there's maybe a little bit of an avoidance in the conversation of what we talk about, and where we as resource transformation maybe have a slightly different perspective in terms of being able to take like a political stance in that. And the first thing that I wanted to bring into the conversation is something that I'm sure most people here have heard before, but I really feel like we need to ground any conversation about philanthropy in that. And that is that the ability to do philanthropic giving is a result of a deeply unjust economic system that we're working in. And that system exploits people and land, and essentially it is slowly destroying our chance of survival because it's destroying our planet. And I think we really must kind of bring that together, that all the problems in the world like poverty, white supremacy, gender inequality, the climate crisis, they're a result of that same economic system, but so is philanthropy. So I just wanted to bring in that together, that like the problems, philanthropy also is a manifestation of it. In the current form it is practiced. Hopefully we can transform it, so that will change. But at Resource Transformation, we always begin our political education process with money stories. So we go around the room and we share where the money comes from and what our experience has been with it. And that's people who have inherited wealth or have jobs that, you know, have allowed them to earn a lot of wealth that puts them in a position where they have too much. And for many people telling these stories, that is an experience that involves a lot of shame and guilt. And the reason for that is that every single story of excess wealth has an aspect of violence and marginalization and oppression to it. So you can always trace back some sort of exploitation that has led to the fact that now there is a person who has access to that amount of money. And I just want to stress this connection, that the fact that some people are able to give and some people are in need is the result of the way we choose to organize society. And at the moment, we organize society in a way that assumes that it is okay that the richest 1% of the world hold almost 2/3 of wealth. Or in Germany, where I'm based, it's the richest 10% holding 60% of wealth. And philanthropy actually currently allows these wealthy people to use their financial influence to impact social ways in ways that suits them without being accountable to anyone, and then also get subsidized for that by the state. So I think we just need to understand that that is the arrangement that we're working with, and that is actually a really undemocratic arrangement, which I think is an unbearable injustice, to be honest, and also it's not a very smart way to organize society. So I just wanted to like weave that awareness and also that anger that I feel about that into the conversation here. And the second thing is that I think there is maybe a little bit of hesitation or lack of inspiration about the role that philanthropy can take in social change. So Erin already mentioned that philanthropy is super political and we are embedded in a political landscape. And that means that if we understand that philanthropy is also a result of the economic system, which is unjust, we also have to think differently about the work that philanthropy should do or can do. So I just wanted to share two approaches that we take at Resource Transformation to be able to like really shift that from, you know, just making grants from an endowment, kind of like the capital gains you get from a big chunk of money, towards a more political way of doing philanthropy, essentially. So one thing is spending down and enabling community wealth building. So the question here is really, how can we shift the stewardship of capital away from the foundation staff and boards to communities and collectives in the solidarity economy? So that could include workers and renters cooperatives, mutual aid funds, participatory funds like Fund Action, for example. But that means not just giving better grants to them based on the capital gains you get from an endowment, but actually shifting the endowment, like the big chunk of money. And the other thing is that I think it's key for people in the philanthropic space or people with access to wealth to advocate for wealth and inheritance tax. So at Resource Transformation, we always say we need to voluntarily redistribute until it becomes mandatory. So the question here is, how can we use philanthropic resources to ensure that wealth in the future does not end up in foundations, but is used to address the urgent financial needs of our societies within a democratic decision-making process. So that includes like building infrastructure for renewable energies, schools, public transport, paying our essential workers well. And one of the tools we have available as a society that is actually democratic, unlike philanthropic grant making, is taxation. And I think it's really important for philanthropic actors to consider this, especially because many foundations do actually get set up as a way to avoid tax. So it is something that is really kind of close to this work. And I'm kind of, noticing that that whole conversation is really avoided in philanthropic spaces. And I'm echoing maybe a little bit Rutger Bregman, who at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago said that it feels like being at a firefighters conference and not being able to talk about water. And I really think that we need to bring in tax into the conversation. And I understand that many of you will probably think that those ideas are very idealistic, but like legally not possible, or that their board will never allow it. And I think that is exactly the point that I want to make, that I would love for philanthropy and also the wealth holders that I organize and I'm part of to be a little bit more brave and excited about making impossible change rather than just the things that feel doable. And that is something that we can learn from social movements who have known that for a really long time, that just because laws are a certain way right now, it doesn't mean that they have to be that way or need to stay that way. And I think we really need to kind of like get more interested in organizing, power building, and imagining a different future in a more radical and transformative way. And that is uncomfortable work, especially if you're in a position of power and privilege. But I really think that that is where the transformation can really happen in terms of the change we need to survive, basically, to bring it back to that. So those were the two things that I wanted to bring to this conversation. I'll link some books and resources that I found really helpful in making sense of all of that in the chat for anyone who would like to dig deeper. And I'll hand it back to Andrew. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thanks, Renée. You've actually anticipated both the questions I was going to ask you in your presentation. So you've done part of my job for you. Interesting to hear you talking about sort of taxation there. In a sense, your second point about sort of using philanthropy to sort of almost unmake philanthropy, to advocate for sort of larger taxes, wealth taxes, a government which has the sort of infrastructure and the experience and hopefully the legitimacy to do redistribution on its own account rather than sort of leaving it to the sort of caprice of philanthropists. The way you work, I'm guessing, means you have a different kind of relationship with the people you work with, social movements, grassroots leaders. Could you talk a little bit about that, how that comes about, and what practical steps you do to create that kind of relationship?
Yeah, I think that happens on two levels. So one of them is that we want to empower our members, to basically build relationships with different social movements that they feel close to. Maybe that's geographically, or maybe they have some reasons to be excited about a certain issue. We have like a catalog of principles that we have our members redistribute by. So that involves supporting groups that advocate for systemic and structural change, but also groups that are led by those most affected. And I think that is kind of quite close to where a lot of the progressive philanthropic giving happens. But we also think that it's really important that members get involved with the political struggle themselves. So go to demonstrations, go to actions, kind of really stand side by side with the movements, get to know them on a personal level. I think that is an important piece. And as an organization, we are currently just talking to many different groups and do that work of relationship building there too. And the goal really is that we enter a movement partnership with one or two movements. And the role model for that is Resource Generation in the US, which is the organization that we're modeled after. They have two movement partnerships that they actually fundraise for. So what we do here at Research Transformation in German-speaking Europe too is that all our members that have access to wealth sign a redistribution pledge. So they basically promise to redistribute a certain amount of money every year. And if we would have a movement partnership, that would also involve kind of signing 10% of that sum to a certain group. But at the moment, we are still in the process of kind of like building the relationship. We're kind of thinking of it as, dating. And then at some point, hopefully we'll find some groups that we'll get into partnership with. At Resource Generation, I think they took like 2 years or something to just get to know different groups because it's I can talk more about that if it's interesting, but there's different factors to consider which groups make sense because we also don't want to get into the situation where we really favor one specific group and don't have a good reason for that basically. But that's what we're doing in general. Yeah.
Great. I've just put a question to all, really, just for us to think about. So, should the job of institutional philanthropy really be to sort of make institutional philanthropy as practiced redundant? Is that really the new role for that philanthropy should transform itself? I'll just sort of plant that for a second and move on to Michael Seberich, our next panelist. Michael's managing partner at Berlin-based Wider Sense. Wider Sense is a social impact advisory organization with a focus on philanthropy and corporate social responsibility. The foundation initiative, #Trust Creates Impact, is hosted by Wider Sense. In 2021, Michael, together with Derek Feldman, co-authored the Corporate Social Mind. Michael, I think you'd probably talk more about Trust Creates Impact today, but I'll leave that up to you to do come in and share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Andrew. And first of all, thank you to Erin, even though she also already had to get to the airport so that she can get where she needs to get. And also thank you to Renée. And for sure, like when I listen to Renée, I'm a little bit like, okay, what am I going to talk about now? Because I definitely talk about the in-between stage, if you want to see it that way. How can we right now work with institutionalized philanthropy, organized philanthropy, and figure out how foundations can also transform themselves in a sense of being more inclusive, being more diverse, being more participatory, listening, etc. And that's in essence what I also wanted to point out. Is really looking one more time at the initiative Trust Creates Impact, which we host as a backbone organization. I will give a little bit of background in a minute. And then look at what we have there, the 9 considerations of the initiative. Sorry, where we, with which we try to really change or try to contribute to a change in institutionalized organized philanthropy in German-speaking countries. But yeah, so Trust Creates Impact is an initiative that's now active for more than 4 years, and is an initiative that brings together more than 30 foundations from Switzerland and from Germany that are all trying to figure out, so what does the future of a foundation look like? So there is already the institutionalization has taken place. What are the things to be considered in these times? And I always do one loop there, and I think it is important in these times to consider the future of philanthropy and foundations, because, and for many good reasons, some of them were presented by Renée, some of them were pointed out already by Erin. Many people question the legitimization of philanthropy and of foundations. If that is the case, and especially that whole discussion, and if you look at all the great or good political analysis of academics in the United States with various books around the role of philanthropy also in democracy, you also find that kind of research also in Europe. Then there is the question of what can foundations do? And so at Trust Creates Impact, our essential idea at the beginning was, so what are the principles that we should look at? And I just very briefly, and I think Amy is also going to, our alliance is also going to share them in the chat in an English version. I already pointed, like the first consideration really is that foundations in the future need to be a lot more valuing, a lot more conscious of what diversity means for their work, both inside and outside of their own walls. So it is that be more inclusive, be more open, but also be more accessible for grantees. The other one we already heard quite a bit about from Erin is, and Andrew also pointed out, that foundations of the future listen. It is a lot more about really sitting down and having that conversation. And the third one is foundations of the future share their power. And Renée already implied a couple of ways how that power sharing can look like. But how does that look like if that foundation is established and it is already there for 500 years? And how do you bring that process within the organization? I think that's one of the essential reasons why Erin and I, in our opening piece for this edition of Alliance, really wrote about that this is about change from the inside out. That in the end, this is a lot also about organizational change for especially organized philanthropy. And the other one that we pointed out as a consideration is foundations of the future are honest with themselves and with others. So that means honest about impact, honest about results, honest about risks. And there is another key thing for us is here. It is also respect towards your own employees, respect towards your grantees, also really looking at this from various sides. The fifth one that we looked at is around that foundations of the future work together in partnerships and networks. And that also was already pointed out by Renée, how important collaboration also in this field is, and that we need to, and Erin also pointed that out. Then we also looked one more time at foundations of the future, take a chance on innovation. And it was innovation, we also especially mean risk-taking. And risk-taking, I think, personally, is becoming one of very, very crucial issues in philanthropy right now. Because in essence, and that may be not true for the people that are attending the session, but in essence, show me the foundation that talks about their mistakes and talks about their learnings. That is changing dramatically, and we see foundations doing that, but for the longest time, that was not part of the culture of philanthropy. The seventh consideration for us is foundations of the future fund with foresight, so looking ahead. And with foresight funding also means not funding project-oriented, but unrestricted structural funding, things that we also have heard before. The last two it's also, that is something I would guess everybody here, you would right away have common agreement that foundations of the future provide more than just money, that it is about how do we say it in the very classical definition of philanthropy? It's about time, talent, treasure, trust, ties. So it's about a lot more than just the money that funders can give, and they can be partners, they can bring connections, and many things else. And last but not least, that actually is one of the considerations that we added in the second edition of these considerations, is that foundations of the future also commit their assets to impact. So the whole thing around that the money that is in the bank, the foundation endowment, also plays a very important role to push the change in philanthropy. So Andrew, that was a whirlwind tour through this, and I hope that helped a little bit. But I really think that these 9 considerations, also going back to everything that I read for the edition of Alliance, really grasp that quite well. Some of it can also be found at trust-based philanthropy in the United States. Some of it can also be found in modern grant making in the UK. The interesting thing, and that may be my last point here, is that all this is mainly driven by the people that work within foundations. And I think that is really also important, that this really comes very strongly also from inside of organized philanthropy, where people say, we want to change this, we want to really push for change here. And yeah, and I think that's really, really important. And for myself, actually, it's really important that that kind of work in our team is especially done, and I really have to say that once, by Anne Jakob and Victoria Hugelshofer and Fabienne Tussaud, who are really pushing this. And by the way, tomorrow we have a workshop where we introduce a change toolbox for these issues, for some of these topics from an organizational development side. So there is something happening, but I think it is really important that that change needs to come from inside these large foundations. That raises, and that maybe is one of the questions to be asked, especially also raises leadership questions.
Thanks, Michael. That's a very interesting point you make about sort of the impetus for change coming from inside as much as from outside. Yeah, that's, yeah, I'm sure we'll talk more about that in the next half hour or so. Just let me ask you, Trust Creates Impact, I think, was first launched in 2019, and since then we've kind of had the pandemic. Have the considerations that you listed, have they changed in any way? Has the sort of the thrust of the initiative changed because of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I would, if you would now, I think in many years, maybe somebody in research will take the first version of the considerations and then the second version of the considerations. And as I said, one of the changes, for instance, has been that we added the issue of asset management also as adding to the thing. But COVID definitely has changed the intonation and the need to be a lot more inclusive in regards to philanthropy, and has also definitely has changed the wording quite a bit. And the other one that has become very, very clear is this power sharing, because here we were suddenly in a digital world, and on the one hand, everything seemed to be so easy, but in the end, also that has created a new divide. So these are some of the things that have definitely changed in this next iteration of the considerations. Yeah, and it was we did that also. That's really important. That's why I always say we are the backbone organization. This all happens in a very participatory process in dialogue with the foundations that are part of this initiative to develop this further.
Right, thank you. I can't resist asking this to both of you, since we've got 2 panelists from the German-speaking world, which is very unusual. Are you sensing or seeing any sort of movement, any sort of impetus for real change within sort of the philanthropic sector in German-speaking countries? Do you see any grounds for optimism that there's a big shift underway, either of you?
Renée, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I'm not sure I can speak so much about the foundation world or the philanthropic sector. I went to the Deutsche Stiftungstag for the first time last year, and I was a bit shocked by how little change I saw, because I usually interact with very progressive, amazing, community-based, collective, participatory organizations and funds. So my perspective on that is quite biased by who we choose to work with. But I think what gives me, reason for optimism is that we have interest from people in the richest 10% that are, very unwell by the situation they're in, which is that they, have access to wealth that they don't think they deserve, they don't think they have earned, they don't think it belongs to them. I feel like that too about my inherited wealth, and that there is kind of this pull towards a more just way of dealing with that wealth, which goes against the social norms of hoarding and growing wealth and passing it on to the next generation, and thereby contributing to a classist society. And I think that gives me hope that we keep having people that are interested in our workshops, that become members, that commit to redistributing their wealth, because they see that the way it is going now is not helpful. And Resource Generation kind of started their work based around this idea of the great wealth transfer. So they kind of say wealth inequality ends with our generation, and it's the same in Germany. If you look at the numbers, there's never been as much wealth transferred from one generation to the next. And if we are able to kind of organize those inheritors and get them to think more progressively and politicize them in a way that then fuels grassroots movements that will then act for change and fight for the change we need to see, that I think is kind of a trajectory that gives me hope. We'll see how it goes, but I think Research Transformation wants to, contribute that part to the situation.
Great. Michael, anything to add?
Well, I think I can add that perspective from the organizational side. From the foundations and from that perspective, what we at least experience. And I think for that, it's always like when we started Trust Creates Impact, or when Trust Creates Impact was started, especially also with the support when at that time Ise Bosch from Drei Linden received the German Foundation Prize, there was that impetus that something needs to be changed and we need to have that discussion. And at that time, and you also would find that in the English text, but I always find it like, what was the task? The task of the initiative was to reflect on and shape the future of foundations. It is that learning process has started. The question is always, is it fast enough? Is that learning process taking place with the speed that we also want to see? We find that there are definitely very interesting impulses, like also on the thought pieces side. One of the things, for instance, that I find very fascinating is the Philanthropy Insight Assessment tool that the Mecenata Institute has developed with some large foundations. So there are really there are things taking place, and what we see is that foundations are asking questions. They're asking themselves, how can we be more participatory? How can we be more inclusive? Some of it takes from an outlet, especially also from a grantees perspective, or especially also from grassroots organization perspectives, takes way too much time, but that is happening and we see change. But moving out of the comfort zone is definitely something that will take time. But I think for these kinds of debates, these kinds of discussions are really important, so that there is also a wider acceptance that change needs to happen. And as I said, for myself, the key thing is here also on a leadership model. And as you know, Andrew, I, together with Jean-Marc Choniat in Montreal, wrote another article for this edition on what does it actually mean for foundation leadership. And I think this is also where we need a dramatic change. We, on the one hand, maybe the leadership needs to change because there need to be different people. But overall, it is also about cultural changes that need to be pushed. not only from the grassroots of these organizations, but also from the top, ideally jointly, so that inclusivity, that openness of foundations can change, and that they can be a lot more participatory, risk taking, everything we talked about, what we would like to see. Great.
Okay, let's bring in some of the questions from the audience. I've got one here from Eva Nagel, who's a senior project manager in Inequality and Global Issues at the Robert Bosch Stiftung. So, when it comes to transforming philanthropy, there's also a growing call for change beyond flexibility in grant making, etc. How many funders are looking into decolonial practices, questioning their power, looking into who receives grants? Any thoughts on that? That seems to be that's a very important topic we've also previously discussed in Alliance. But Renée, any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
the importance of that.
That is so important. I kind of feel like if you really engage in a decolonial practice of going back and considering where the wealth came from, it kind of, there's no other way, you know, there's no other way than becoming a much more progressive funder. And it's really amazing to see some of the work that Resource Generation members are doing in the US, where they kind of like trace back the way their ancestors have made money by enslaving people and having these plantations, and then kind of redistributing to the movement for Black life that wealth, kind of giving it back to the people that essentially created it. So those links are pretty cool to see. And I think from a German perspective, we are a bit behind when it comes to really grappling with our own colonial past. I hope that we will make progress there. And also, what is interesting from a German perspective again, or German speaking perspective, is that we also have this layer of anti-Semitism as an oppressive structure that is really relevant to many money stories of the people that we organize. So it's also true for my own money stories, where the company that my wealth comes from participated, you know, in forced labor during the Second World War and produced weapons for the Nazi regime. So I think those kind of things are also important to weave into the decolonial practice. And yeah, I would love to see more foundations kind of having, you know, despite like next to our story, like these are all the great things we've done, kind of the story of the funder, like where does the money come from, and like a true, honest story about it. I think that would be such an important piece of it. And that goes beyond, you know, bringing in diverse faces on the board that kind of then appease people. It really just is about being honest and transparent. And then those progressive steps, I think, that come from there will be much easier. And one last thing that I would like to mention is that I think there is space for philanthropy also to engage in a conversation around reparations, which is kind of the way states give back the stolen money. So I think that could be really interesting to look at as well, how reparations on a state level play into that. And that's, again, politicizing the role of foundations and institutions in that space. Yeah.
Great. Michael, anything to add to that? I mean, does it seem to you that sort of the use of the talk about sort of just widening the board, bringing in sort of different communities, representing different communities on the board, is that simply tokenism, or do we need to go a lot deeper than that, do you think?
No, I don't think that is tokenism. That is something that we really need to pursue, and we have to. I think it goes hand in hand with the question of what does diversity in our societies mean, and and I really think that is very, very important, up to the fact that I can also mainly look at the continental European perspective, but just look at the diversity of staff within foundations and so on, and how do they really represent the society that they want to help to create a positive change. So these are definitely questions. And again, maybe I'm a little bit more on the optimistic side here, but we see this happening. So we, for instance, were just involved in designing a program that that hopefully will bring people of color into the philanthropic space, also as professionals. And so it is like doing these kind of things, I think, is really important. And but we have a long way to go. There's no question about it. On the colonialism, I also think that is something where we need to have a discussion. I'm a trained anthropologist, so I definitely, like, yes, I also raise a lot of questions, but it also, like, at least from a German perspective, we also have to see that, and for sure there can always be done more, but that many families and also corporations already have looked into their history very closely, and some of them also have drawn conclusions out of that. So it's always the question whether that is enough. That is definitely something to be discussed. But to a certain extent, and that is also what is happening, other countries and also in philanthropy, other players sometimes actually now look at Germany and how we have dealt with some of the history, as difficult as it was. But also that is something, I think there we also internationally, we can all learn from each other with the various dimensions and all the difficulties. That's a topic where you walk on very thin ice in regards to what is right and what is wrong and what do people sense. But it is another one of these passes that we have to take, I'm pretty sure.
Sure. It's turned to a question here from Marcus Jenner. I'm not quite sure where he's from, but he asks, what are the consequences of these considerations, sort of guilt, injustice, redistribution, reparations? What are the consequences of those for the way we assess the difference we make as a funder? Do we need also to redefine the way we conceptualize impact and how we assess impact?
That is nice that Marcus is asking that question.
So do you want to come back on that straight away? Should I go to you, Renée? Do you want to have a first go at that?
I can go ahead.
Okay.
I really think that goes with the fact that if we in the future talk about impact, we cannot also only talk about the impact that we perceive as the people that are the grant makers, but we also have to look at, for instance, the perspective of the activists, of the people that are supposed to be supported, and how they experience the beneficiaries, as it sometimes is also called. How do they experience? So I think impact also will have a different dimension. Up to the fact that I think this already starts with what do I actually want to create through a grant that I'm giving. But overall, in the future, I think it will be more and more important to be also participatory about the interpretation of impact.
Renée, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that is such a good point, to define what counts for success. I think that's really important. I was just reflecting a little bit on the fact that we don't use the language of impact that much in our organizing, because I have to say that a lot of the kind of impact measurement efforts are quite problematic, because many of the social justice work or systemic change you can't quantify, you can't count. So I'm a little bit hesitant about that that whole thing, and I feel like that it actually tries to, you know, squeeze civil society justice work into a capitalist mindset, which is not super helpful. So for me, the language of justice or solidarity is much more helpful, and also healing, because I think the questioner brought in, you know, the word of guilt as well, and I think for our members it is this process of you know, disconnection, isolation, guilt, shame, and we want to bring them towards a place of, you know, feeling in solidarity, feeling in community, and that is a process of healing, and that is a politicizing process that brings different groups closer together, and, you know, brings them together in the same struggle for a shared goal of justice. So I think it does change the way we think about impact, and I would kind of encourage funders to think less about impact in the sense of, like, how can I pick the project with the most impact, and rather think about what change do I want to see in the world, as a part of the world, and which are the groups that I'm working on, and how can I support them? How can I be a partner? So it's less of this kind of I'm trying to maximize impact and thinking more about, okay, so I want to see change in the world. Yeah, and one other thing I think is also important to think about is that it's not about maximizing impact or scaling impact. It's also about deepening impact and thinking about things on a local level that are really transformative, that really kind of change the dynamics of how we relate to each other in society. I think that could be cool to see more focus on those deep impact ideas rather than it has to be big. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think we've just got time for one more question before we start rounding this up. This is from Hugh Davidson, the H&S Davidson Trust. What due diligence, if any, is advisable before committing to unrestricted funding of a local community organisation? And what do you see as the key elements of unrestricted funding? Renée, do you want to go in on that one straight away?
Sorry, could you repeat it one more time? I was distracted by the chat.
What due diligence, if any, is advisable before committing to unrestricted funding of a local community organisation?
Yeah, I think very little. So we don't do any due diligence aside from kind of checking if an organization is led by the people that they're trying to help. So that is kind of the main criteria. And I always think that if there's a group fighting for their own rights and their own well-being, then anything that they do is great. And if I want to support that group, then I trust that they know what they need. And yeah, so I don't have that much to say about that, I guess, from that perspective.
Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit more boring on that one, because I would definitely also say there are some certain legal requirements that you always have to check. But then there is the other dimension of trust and trust building. And I know that is a heavily used word right now in our community. But I think it is really, in the end, do I have a sense that I also have built up a relationship with that organization where I know everything, like they will do what they need to do, and they are also the experts in what they are doing, and especially when they work for their own community. But there is that in-between step that I would always raise. And it's interesting, last year we did a lot of qualitative interviews with foundation heads. And one of the most interesting things was that a couple of people said, for myself, the most important criteria to give these unrestricted or to give grants that are more organizational support grants is really the relationship between my grant managers and these organizations. And is there a trust-based relationship? And I think this is where it becomes very tangible what trust in the end also means. With all the challenges that has in expressing also power inequalities, etc. But I think that is essential.
Right, thank you. And well, unfortunately, we're heading into the last few minutes now, so I'm going to ask both of you just for a quick sort of for a wrap up here. Either you got a kind of key takeaway or a key insight on transforming philanthropy that you'd like to share as a last thought? Renée, over to you.
Yeah, maybe coming back to the question that you brought in earlier, but then we didn't really follow up on whether or not institutional philanthropy should survive in a way. And I just thought of one quote that really fitted from the podcast that I also linked, which is that philanthropy will die with capitalism. And I just wanted to kind of leave that here. So if we want to change the way capitalism is wrecking our planet, then I think philanthropy will change in the process. But philanthropy means, love for humans, if you translate it. And I think there will be some form of that built into organizations, whether that is kind of resource sharing in communities, whether that is, funds allocated by governments to certain projects in civil society, whatever that is. I don't know what it will look like, but I think, yeah, money will go to the right places, basically. But the way philanthropy is set up right now, I don't think should survive if we really manage to change things on a deep level.
Well, thanks for picking up on that question, Renee. It's great. Glad someone did. Michael, the last words of Michael Seberich.
Well, I think the important thing is philanthropy is a lot older than capitalism. And so maybe it is really what Renée in the end said. It is about the kind of philanthropy that we're seeing today that may really change. I worked as an anthropologist on the northwest coast of British Columbia, and the potlatch is a very old traditional form of sharing wealth. And some people would also call that philanthropy. And so it's I think that is really important to consider. But in regards to your, like getting back one more time to your question, interestingly enough, Andrew, I would say when I look back at the articles that were written for this edition, and then I look at the reflection that Erin and I wrote, then interestingly enough, it is again the importance of collective action. I think that has also become very important in this conversation. But then it is this whole question about how can power be shifted and how can resources be shifted. And last but not least, it is the changing practices from the inside out. It is, you know, there are foundations in Germany that are older than 500 or 600 years. And it will be interesting to see how these organizations change to some of the challenges that are out there right now. And that we are also asking, and as I said before, that are rightly asked and that are where rightly philanthropy is questioned in what it is doing and how it is doing things. And I think that is important, or that is for myself, these are key observations that I got out of this very challenging task of getting this alliance issue off the ground.
Right, and thanks again for your help in doing that. And thanks to Renée for her contribution as well. But we're about out of time. I hope you've all enjoyed today's discussion. If you have, and you don't forget to use the link in the chat to take advantage of the 50% discount to subscribe to Alliance. The code is transform50. I'd also like to end by saying thanks to our expert panelists for their time and sharing their wisdom and their insights with us, and to Erin, who's unfortunately had to leave, and to Mercer for sponsoring today's event. Talking about Mercer, Mercer will also be hosting their Global Investment Forum in March, which brings together the investment community to discuss the latest themes: shifts in geopolitical structures, monetary and economic policy, sustainability, and new technologies that are shaping markets and investment practices. Each of the event offers a day of main sessions, specialist streams, and keynote addresses. So if you'd like to attend that, you can register using the link in the chat on today's discussion. I'd also like to thank the Alliance team, in particular Amy McGoldrick, who's produced today's event, and most of all of you for taking part. The Alliance's event series will continue with a look at the future of Asian philanthropy in partnership with the Asia Philanthropy Circle. Details of that will be announced shortly, so keep a lookout for that. Lastly, still on this topic, the Wings Network has been working on the issue of philanthropy transformation since last year, and will shortly launch a piece of research on a website in May of this year. So in advance of that, look out for Executive Director Benjamin Bellige's piece in our March issue, which will be worth reading. We'll describe that initiative and what it's done so far. So once again, thanks to all involved, and goodbye. And we look forward to see you again in the future. Take care.